Hi, my name is Maddie Mullenbrook, and I will be sharing information with you about medical practices of the 19th century. Prior to the 19th century, there was a major lack of knowledge when it came to the location of internal organs, as well as what roles the organs played. Traditional ideas of anatomy was that women were smaller versions of men, and they used the term turned outside in, relating to different body parts of men and women. The understanding of disease transmission was very low during this time. People thought that sickness and diseases were inherited susceptibility, or as we know today, genetics passed down through families. Also, water and airborne illnesses did not exist to people at this time. They were not normally accepted into believing that water and airborne infections were possible. People thought that diseases such as cholera and yellow fever were caused by bad air, violent emotion, wet feet, or passionate fear or rage. And with our knowledge today, we know that things such as these would not cause serious, deadly diseases, but they didn't know any better back then. Some treatments prior to the 19th century consisted in bleeding out by cup or leech. They believed that toxins would be released through the loss of blood, when in reality that is not possible. They also used emectic and laxative purgation, which would be throwing up, and they also used power of prayer to help people get better. The cell theory was brought about by 3 German scientists named Theodor Schwann, Matthias Jakob Schleiden, and Rudolf Virchow. The development of the cell theory is, in summary, it says that all living things are composed of cells, and that cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things. All cells are produced from other cells. The cell theory helped explain biological processes, changes in cells, and explanations about fertilization and growth. Overall, the cell theory was a major cornerstone of modern medicine. Rudolf Virchow was one of the great contributors to the cell theory. A fun fact about him was that he was the first person to discover leukemia cells. He also believed in cell division, but he found out that only certain types of cells divide. He found out that every cell comes from an existing cell before that. So he put to rest the idea of spontaneous generation, which is what they believed prior to the 19th century, which meant organisms could arise from non-living matter. After the cell theory came the germ theory. Prior to the 19th century, they believed in spontaneous generation, which is what I had said on the slide before this, which Virchow put to rest. They also believed that foul-smelling miasmas, also known as air-containing particles of rotting matter, were the culprits behind major epidemics like cholera. This theory was another major theory in the cornerstone of modern medicine. There were 3 major names in the germ theory, which were John Snow, Louis Pasteur, and Robert Koch. John Snow focused on cholera, Louis Pasteur focused on microorganisms, and Robert Koch focused on the germ theory of disease. I will continue to go more in depth in the following slides. John Snow, also known as the father of epidemiology, was a major role player in the growth of modern health. He was who traced the source of the cholera outbreak in Soho, London, and he found out that the infection was in contaminated water, and he established a link between water and infection. Snow created a dot map to show the cluster of cases around the contaminated pump. He used statistics to illustrate the connection between the quality of the water source on Broad Street and the deaths caused by cholera on a dot map. He did major work in public health and in geology linked together, which resulted in the science of epidemiology. This is the map that John Snow used to illustrate the statistics that he found during the 1854 cholera epidemic on Broad Street in Soho, London. Louis Pasteur was a French chemist who also played a large role in the germ theory. Like Virchow, he also helped overturn the idea of life being spontaneously generated. He focused a major amount of his work on microorganisms. He found out that the chemical process of milk souring, and he invented a way to remove bacteria, also known as pasteurization, stemming from his last name. This finding ceased to be the source of tuberculosis and other diseases. His work also consisted of vaccines against rabies and anthrax. Robert Koch was the founder of modern bacteriology. He was a German doctor who validated the germ theory of disease. He identified cholera, tuberculosis, and anthrax were all caused by bacteria. He also discovered that microorganisms are sources of disease. He improved laboratory technologies and techniques significantly throughout his lifetime. Koch also created Koch's postulates, which consisted of 4 generalized principles linking specific microorganisms to particular diseases. These postulates are still used in the medical field today. Many branches of microbiology continue to come to light. Many tropical diseases, such as malaria and yellow fever, which could not be linked to bacterium, were found to be due to parasitic microbes. For example, mosquitoes. At the end of the era, viruses were discovered by Walter Reed, who learned a lot of his information from Russian pathologist Dmitry Ivanovsky. I will go more in depth about Walter Reed in the next slide. Walter Reed was an American surgeon who discovered that yellow fever was caused by a virus. This finding led to eventually more knowledge about viruses. They originally were thought to be invisible throughout the 19th century, until the invention of the electron microscope came about in the 1940s. Viruses were identified as a cause of host diseases. Some viruses include smallpox, influenza, the common cold, chickenpox, polio, and most recently, AIDS. They also were believed to be a major role in cancer. Anesthesia and antiseptics also came about in the 19th century around the time of the 1840s. Anesthesia finally made extensive, painful surgeries practical. Before anesthesia, surgical options were limited by the pain of the person awake, so basically how much pain tolerance they would be able to have. And also there were very many dangers of infection after surgery. Anesthesia came about when American dentists started with nitrous oxide leading to anesthetics. This method was later adopted in Europe for surgical purposes, not in the dental field. And this led to performance of long, delicate surgeries that were not available to happen before anesthesia came on because it was too painful. After surgeries, though, unsterile equipment led to many fatal infections. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician who was the early founder of antiseptic procedures, particularly in the childbirth area. He believed that infections following childbirth due to unwashed hands of doctors led to many deaths to women who were giving birth. Many doctors were offended by his ideas due to no scientific proof that the reason that they were dying was due to their unwashed hands. And eventually he was put into an insane asylum where he was killed by guards 14 days after he was admitted. Luckily enough, some of the medical field took his advice, and many women's lives were saved from childbed fever due to his findings about the unsanitary conditions of unwashed hands. Joseph Lister was a British surgeon who also studied Pasteur's laboratory work, and he began to dip bandages into carbolic acid to remove germs and bacteria, and he would pour acid into the wounds to sterilize them. This eventually greatly reduced the death rate, and due to open wounds and disease and infections getting in them, and this established antiseptic surgery. Eventually, this led to sterilization of environments that would be having surgery or any kind of open wound, and by the 20th century, sterile operating rooms were a must, and you're not supposed to have an unsanitary operating room. So this information greatly helped the death rate go down. At the end of the era, in 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays. This was just one medical advance in scientific instruments that happened during the 19th century. Overall, the 19th century was more well known for monitoring and containment of diseases rather than actual cures for diseases. But overall, many positive discoveries came from the 19th century.